Welcome and a good afternoon, morning or evening to all of you, wherever you may be joining us from. My name is Simon Reid-Henry, and I'm the director of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen Mary University of London. The IHSS was established in 2018 to bring together scholars from across the faculty's 8 schools to share ideas, to develop new research and explore innovative approaches to scholarly and public problems alike. And despite the unprecedented challenges of a global pandemic, we've continued to grow and to develop our mission of supporting the highest quality of interdisciplinary work across the humanities and social sciences. One of the things we've done this year is to launch a COVID-19 working group that has been exploring the fundamental issue of social trust in the context of the pandemic. And trust is, of course, a theme which echoes through to today's event as well. Queen Mary is a university which has long been at the forefront of pushing for social justice and equality. From Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the suffragist and first woman to qualify as a doctor in this country. She was an alumna of the London Hospital Medical College, one of the 4 entities which would merge to form Queen Mary, to recent efforts to pioneer the use of the living wage on campus. Our annual symposium celebrates those values by bringing to Queen Mary each year the author of a book or body of work that not only makes a major intellectual contribution, but which carries the potential to transform social and political debate more broadly. For this reason, I'm delighted to introduce the speaker for our 2nd annual symposium, Professor Shoshana Zuboff. And a very warm welcome to you, Shoshana. Professor Zuboff picks up the torch of our annual series from where Thomas Piketty left off last year in a fascinating discussion on the deep history and politics of inequality. And we were deeply honored, Shoshana, when you accepted our invitation to join us today to discuss a topic that you have done really more than any other to shed a light upon, the rise of surveillance capitalism and what this means for the information civilization, form of humanity that we all inhabit today. Professor Zuboff is Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School and a faculty associate at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights. She is a scholar, writer, and activist, and the author of 3 major books, each of which signaled the start of a new epoch in technological society. She writes widely in the international press, and if you follow her on Twitter, you will know she is deeply engaged and passionate about the issues which she dissects so sharply in her books. Before I go on to say a few words about the Age of Surveillance Capitalism, however, a little housekeeping for those of you in the audience, and welcome to you all too. We have a large audience, and so the room, as it were, is on mute, but you are welcome to pose questions in the chat, in fact, in the Q&A, and please also include your full name and affiliation with the question. Please bear in mind also that all comments are recorded and that this is a live broadcast. If you would like to tweet about today's event, you're very welcome. Please use the hashtag QMZuboff. Our own IHSS hashtag is QMIHSS, and our Twitter handle is @QMUL_HSS. With that all hopefully clear then, the format for this afternoon's event will be as follows. In a few moments, Professor Zuboff is going to speak for around half an hour. We will then have a Q&A during which you're welcome to begin posting your questions. I know that Professor Zuboff is keen to make sure we find time towards the end for your questions to become a part of that discussion, so please don't be shy. And finally, just a few words then, if I may, about this book and why I think it's such a fitting achievement to feature in this symposium, and indeed Professor Zuboff's work coming out of it. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is a colossal undertaking. It has already been translated into 25 languages, which is 24 more than most of us get translated into. But big, as Shoshana's brilliant book reminds us, is not always better. More pertinent, perhaps, is the fact that this book has been hailed as the tech industry's silent spring and the Das Kapital of the digitalized 21st century. That's Zadie Smith's words, not mine. There are books which come and go. But when you think back to the impact that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had, when you see how it captured the zeitgeist, not just of a moment, but of an era coming, you catch a glimpse, I think, of what this book is all about. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is an eloquent and incredibly well substantiated argument against technological inevitability without ever losing faith in technological possibility. I think this is just right. Space exploration is admirable, but humankind can do without putting Jeff Bezos into space. In any case, when it comes to space tourism, Laika the dog got there first on Sputnik 2 in 1957. The story of what became of Laika is one I'll leave you all to look up, but it is in fact surprisingly relevant to what Professor Zuboff has long been telling us, for it reminds us of the lived material costs of the drive for technological mastery, technological inevitabilism, as she puts it. But of course, the difference between the human costs of a totalitarian ideology and the human costs of what, in another term, she calls instrumentarian ideology, is that the workings of the latter, of surveillance capitalism, are largely invisible, for all that they may be no less destructive at the end of the day. Monopoly technology, this digital world we've all been intensely inhabiting the past year or so, as social media became the nearest available approximation to having a social life, is a key pillar of surveillance capitalism, of course. But as the book also shows, as Shoshana's larger body of work, in fact, shows, it's far from the only one. And as she unpicks the history of the making of this water in which we all swim, often without really thinking about it, she picks also at a number of nagging philosophical concerns. Where does the digital come from, really? Where within us? What needs does it answer? What desires does it fulfill? Through what power relations and via what forms of inequality are those desires shackled and chained and sold off to the highest bidder? The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is a wake-up call and a book that is rich with metaphors. In Shoshana's hands, personalized ads become, rightly, I think, guerrilla attacks, if not fracking operations launched upon the human person. And from insights like these comes perhaps the fundamental take-home of the book, which is to implore us to open our eyes and look what industrial capitalism has done to physical nature, and then imagine, just for a moment, what surveillance capitalism could yet do to human nature. Professor Zuboff is, amongst other things, a wonderful storyteller, and if you haven't read the book, you are about to find out. So I won't give away any more of her story here. Suffice to say that I would encourage you all to read it, and I hope you all enjoy everything that Professor Zuboff has to tell us today. Shoshana, welcome to the IHSS. The room is all yours.
Thank you so much, Simon. You honor me with this invitation today. You honor me by being such a close and careful reader of material that, you know, many was the dark night when I thought to myself, well, somewhere on the planet, somebody will read this. So perhaps that was you, Simon. Thank you so much for those kind words. And thanks to Anna, thanks to the faculty at the Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen Mary, and all of you at Queen Mary who elected to have me with you here today. I'm humbled and honored by the opportunity, and so thrilled that so many of you have turned in. So start putting your thinking caps on and ask me questions so we can have some roaring good conversation at the end of all this, all right? So as Simon prefigured, I do want to begin with a story. And this is actually a true life story. It's a recent account, but funnily enough, and since we're part of the humanities undertaking today, I chose an account that brings to life the medieval alchemist's dream, which was the translation of secret knowledge into secret power. So this story comes to us via none other than your illustrious Channel 4 investigative news team, which broke this story in September of last year, 2020. And it's a story about the Trump 2016 campaign's effort to deter Black American citizens from voting on Election Day. The investigative team examined more than 5,000 leaked data files, with details on 200 million individual American voters, along with the analyses and models used to profile things like personality traits, political attitudes, behavioral dispositions, interests, concerns, vulnerabilities, and more, in order to target and manipulate voter behavior, especially in the key swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. All right, so they only had a modest budget to expand Trump's base, and the campaign's digital director, a guy named Brad Parscale, had gambled it all on Facebook. That was his big bet. We're going to invest it all on Facebook. And Facebook ponied up too, because they offered corporate staff members embedded with the Trump campaign to help these folks dominate what the Facebook people called, and here I need air quotes to show you how I feel about this, the tools. We will be hearing this frequently, the tools. Okay. Pascal used those tools to identify citizens least likely to support Trump, least likely. This they called an audience, following Facebook's normal advertising practices, and they labeled this audience deterrence. 54% of this group were people of color, including 3.5 million Black voters. A senior campaign official at the time boasted to reporters of the campaign's, quote, major voter suppression operations underway. Black citizens were bombarded with the standard range of algorithmic targeting mechanisms that are used in Facebook's advertising every day. Subliminal cues, engineered social comparisons, psychological micro-targeting, recommendation tools, real-time rewards and punishments, gamification, and more. Messages were engineered to produce negative views of Hillary Clinton, but also to persuade Black citizens that the most effective expression of Black protest was to withdraw entirely from the election process. The collection, computation, and manipulation of massive scale knowledge about these citizens produced massive scale behavioral change among these citizens. Black voter turnout declined by 7 percentage points, the largest decline on record for Black Americans. Black voter turnout in swing states where the targeting was heaviest was a full 1 point lower than in the non-battleground states. All right, so what happened? What just happened? The episode suggests that citizens of the world's longest lived democracy relinquished their most solemn democratic right, the right to vote, without anyone ever holding a gun to their heads or showing up in the dead of night to threaten them with the gulag or the camp. Instead, these citizens ceded the right to self-govern in response to nothing more than engineered digital communications, freighted with inflammatory messages and disinformation tailored to individual psychological and political profiles, until enough people chose to stay home on election day. This is not the totalitarian nightmare of Big Brother, who breaks bodies in order to bend souls to his single truth. No, this is the work accomplished by what I have called instrumentarian power, secretly wrung from secret knowledge, harnessed to the diminishment of human dignity through the friction-free conquest of human agency, autonomy, and self-determination, mediated by not Big Brother, but rather the big other of connected, panvasive architectures of digital instrumentation. Instrumentarian power annuls dignity without the threat of terror, violence, or murder. No blood, no bodies, no fingerprints, no enemy, no combat, seamless. In January 2020, as the world braced for another ugly election season that would test the resilience of American democracy, a Facebook executive, Andrew Bosworth, posted a blunt memo crediting his corporation with Donald Trump's surprise 2016 electoral victory. Quote, "So was Facebook responsible for Donald Trump getting elected? I think the answer is yes, but not for the reasons anyone believes," unquote. Mr. Bosworth laid Trump's success at the feet of Facebook's titanic machine operations known to the world as online targeted advertising. Mr. Trump was elected, Bosworth said, quote, "because he ran the single best digital ad campaign I've ever seen from any advertiser, period." Bosworth lavishly praised Pascal, insisting that Trump 2016, quote, "remains the high watermark of digital ad campaigns," close quote. And he observed that this unbelievable work was the product of a simple discipline, quote, "they just used the tools. We had to show the right creative to each person." Pascal himself confirmed this conclusion in his own inimitable style. I'll quote Pascal. "I always wonder why people in politics act like this stuff is so mystical. It's the same shit we use in commercial. It just has fancier names." Close quote. Bosworth's praise, Pascal's confirmation. These tell us everything we need to know. What qualifies as the best single ad campaign ever is mastery of the alchemy that underlies all of Facebook's machine operations, the transformation of secret knowledge into secret power. This economic logic, the economic logic that drives this transformational capability, is what I have called surveillance capitalism. It's bigger than Facebook, because now it cuts across not only the tech sector, not only the tech giants, but the normal economy as we are accustomed to thinking of it, through literally every economic domain. Bosworth asserts, and Pascal agrees, that Mr. Trump's electoral success depended upon surveillance capitalism's bread and butter economic operations, data extraction, analysis, algorithmic targeting. I have called the economics that shape these mechanisms surveillance capitalism because they maintain core elements of traditional capitalism. Things like private property, market exchange, growth, profit. But these cannot be realized without the technologies and social relations of surveillance. Hidden methods of observation secretly consume private experience and translate it into behavioral data. These operate outside of human awareness, robbing actors of the right to know and with it the right to combat. In an extraordinary development, these ill-gotten human-generated data are then immediately claimed as corporate property, available for manufacture and sales. Make no mistake, the theory of surveillance capitalism challenges this private property claim and redefines it as theft. In today's surveillance economy, personal information is the stolen treasure and surveillance is the getaway car. The entire economic edifice is built on this illegitimate bed of sand. These data then join complex supply chains. They travel to computational factories where they are computed into behavioral predictions and finally sold to business customers in a new kind of market that trades exclusively in predictive knowledge of human behavior. These are commodity markets in human futures, akin to other commodity futures markets like pork belly futures or wheat futures or oil futures. Surveillance capitalists sell the promise of certainty, a promise which requires data extraction and computation at an unprecedented and therefore unimaginable scale, both an expression and an extension of instrumentarian power. Example, another leaked document, Facebook describes its, quote, AI backbone, which is its manufacturing hub, as ingesting trillions of behavioral data points every day and producing 6 million behavioral predictions each second. The first globally successful prediction product was the click-through rate. It's a behavioral prediction sold into the first stunningly lucrative human futures markets, known as targeted online advertising. But predictive markets in human futures have, as I've suggested, proliferated across the normal economy, far from targeted advertising. Commodity trading in human futures provides the financial incentives for this 21st century alchemy, the secret massive scale extraction of human generated data, and the equally secret massive scale control of human behavior. But secret knowledge and secret power ensured that neither citizens nor lawmakers would fully grasp the consequences of this foundational institution and the economic imperatives that drive it toward totalities of data extraction. So listen, when corporate profits depend upon making all human behavior more predictable across the entire landscape of everyday life, we're not talking about factories and offices. We're not talking about the economic domain. We're talking about bodies and homes, cars and cities, all the territories that link them. And when private experience is redefined as free raw material for these operations of ubiquitous extraction of private experience, then the emerging economic imperatives unleash a cascade of anti-democratic consequences that strike at the moral taproot of democracy, human dignity. And they strike equally at its superstructure, now characterized by unprecedented concentrations of knowledge about people and the unaccountable power that accrues to such knowledge. These new axes of inequality are measured in the gap between what I can know and what can be known about me, and what I can do and what can be done to me. I have spent exactly 43 years studying the rise of the digital as a political economic force. And over the course of these last 2 decades, I've had my most frightening lesson as I've observed the once fledgling internet companies morph into surveillance empires, powered by these global architectures of behavioral monitoring, analysis, targeting, prediction, and control, rooting, spreading, and flourishing like an invasive species without predators. In its wake, industrial civilization decisively gave way to a young information civilization. Think about it. In 1986, at that point, I had been studying computerization in the workplace for nearly a decade. At that point, also, only 1% of the world's information was stored digitally. And even by the year 2000, after the World Wide Web, only 25% of the world's information was stored digitally. That was the same year that the first early elements of surveillance capitalism were discovered at Google. And then by the year 2007, a great leap forward. Digital storage had jumped to 97%. It is now possible to say that on the strength of their surveillance capabilities and for the sake of their surveillance profits, these new empires engineered a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic who. Epistemic refers, as you know, to all things about knowledge and knowing. The epistemic coup is a revolutionary takeover of what is known, how it is known, and who can know it. It proceeds in 4 stages, each preparing the way for the next. The first is the unilateral and illegitimate appropriation of elemental epistemic rights, the right to know about my own experience. The second is the sharp rise in epistemic inequality. The third is the spread of epistemic chaos, best expressed in the rise of disinformation and misinformation. And the fourth is the institutionalization of epistemic dominance. Each stage develops the conditions for the next. I won't go into the detail now of what these stages are, because there's some other things that I want to discuss first, but we can certainly explore these in more detail in our discussion. All right. With this canvas in mind and these ideas on the table, I want to return for a moment to the notion of information civilization and its origins. You know, there's so much scholarship on the concept of civilization, and all the reading I've done on this point, I'm most partial to a very short note. It's not really even rated as an article. It's a note that was co-authored in the year 1913 by 2 of my favorite thinkers who really wrestled with the rise of industrial civilization. One is Emile Durkheim and the other Marcel Mauss. To the question, what is civilization? They reply, a civilization is a social phenomenon, and it's something that is not strictly attached to a determinate social organism like a specific society or country or nation state. Rather, it constitutes a kind of moral milieu, encompassing a certain number of nations, yes, and each national culture, of course, being only a particular form of this larger whole, this larger moral milieu. The civilization does not have well-defined limits. It passes beyond the political frontiers of nations, and it extends over less easily definable spaces. Its complexity, they say, renders its study difficult, and yet we cannot deny its unity and its very existence. These systems of facts, Durkheim and Mauss reckoned, required a special name, and the name that they thought was best suited to it was civilization. So theirs is a vision of a superordinate collective life that takes on distinct shades within distinct societies and nations, but shares a large swath of humanity as its medium and its canvas. Quote, civilization's most essential elements, unquote, they stress, quote, are not the product of the state or of the people alone. Rather, they are driven by a power of expansion originating within them. When I read those words, I think of a volcano or an earthquake, a force that contains its own powers of expansion. Not all social phenomena have this power, of course, but the internet and the World Wide Web, this was precisely the kind of phenomenon defined from the start as a civilizational medium that brooked no boundaries of nations, industries, organizations, or hierarchies. It entailed this kind of force that expanded it, drove it from within. And then we have a very different kind of institution, an economic institution of surveillance capitalism, which is also precisely this kind of phenomenon, one whose internal logic compelled it through the economies of scale and scope and data extraction, compelled from within, driven to extraction for the sake of certainty, driven to extraction for the sake of enough data to produce the certainty, to reach the totality of human generated data from every source and every person in every place, that would allow it to ever approximate certainty. These unexpectedly powerful forces not only had a life of their own, but then without anyone really having been aware that this happened, at some point in the early part of our digital century, these two forces merged. The internet, the World Wide Web, and surveillance capitalism merged. One a network built of hardware and software, the other a political, economic, institutional logic. And they merged to an agree that now it is possible to say that the internet itself is owned and operated by the institution of surveillance capitalism. There's nowhere to go online where you don't find yourself marching through surveillance capitalism's channels and supply chains. The civilizational spread is also enabled by two elements that Durkheim and Moss talked about. They said these social phenomena that expand from within typically are characterized by two things. One, they have the capacity to travel. And second, people borrow them. They travel and they are frequently borrowed. And what are these elements that make something like this travel and be borrowed? Well, these are elements that we're well familiar with. There are things like myths and stories, capital and commerce, art, tools, language, science, ideas. These things travel and are borrowed. Of course, the internet itself came adorned with powerful myths that appealed to people across many societies. And these myths were rapidly adapted and co-opted by surveillance capitalism. The myth of the empowerment of the individual through the democratization of knowledge and the democratization and social power of connection. The myth of a new world called cyberspace, free of the old constraints, such as laws, norms, rights, values, and principles. The myth of inevitability that would become the myth of inevitability that said that everything, every person, place, or thing would become transparent, connected, and rendered as data. And therefore, that every person, place, or thing should become transparent, connected, and rendered as data, no matter the consequences. And of course, these myths of a digital golden age traveled easily and were borrowed eagerly. But the myths themselves were incomplete because the myth makers chose to conceal the one true inevitability in every mythic journey: danger. Danger and its conquest. They omitted the poison chalice from which each human being would have to drink the elixir of empowerment, and how we would then face that poison and how we would battle it. So now we have some ideas on the table. Let me start from the beginning. We have the alchemist dream realized in surveillance capitalism, secret knowledge and its transformation into secret instrumentarian power. We have the economic logic and operations of surveillance capitalism. We have a revolutionary epistemic coup, a takeover of what is known, how it is known, and who can know it. And now we have a glimpse into the origins of information civilization. With these in mind, we can ask the question that I hope we will continue to explore in our discussion, our question period. It's the question that Durkheim and Mauss are waiting for us to ask. What can we say now about the moral milieu of our information civilization, especially at this early stage of its development? In an information civilization, principles of social order derive from questions of knowledge. How is it distributed? What is the authority that governs its distribution? What is the power that protects that authority? These can be summarized in what I call the three essential questions. Who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? Knowledge, authority, and power. The crazy thing is, for us now, surveillance capitalists hold the answers to each of these questions, though they have never been elected to govern. This is the essence of the epistemic coup. They claim the authority to decide who knows by asserting ownership rights over our personal information. They use those ownership rights to manipulate information and people through systems of instrumentarian power. And they then defend that authority with epistemic dominance, the absolute control over critical information systems and infrastructures. Indeed, this moral milieu is in many ways the precise opposite of the promised golden age. Instead of democratization and empowerment, we find new forms of absolutism, inequality, and diminishment. I'll bring these remarks to a close and bridge to our discussion time with a rather unscientific response to the question that I've posed about the moral milieu of our young information civilization. So I'm going to end with another story, this one a personal one, drawn from the 14 months that I spent on the road in America and Europe after The Age of the Smart Machine was published. In January 2019, I left home for a 3-week book tour, and I spent the majority of the next 14 months traveling and talking to people in growing numbers in many cities and countries about these themes. And I did that until the pandemic froze me and all of us in our tracks. But during those months, I spoke to so many people, so many events, large audiences, and I always began the event in the same way. And if we were here together in the same big room, we would be doing this too. So the first thing I did was I looked around the room and I said, look, you know, you could be home having dinner, you could be out at a great movie, you could be making love. What brought you here tonight or this afternoon to this talk? Please think about it. Boil it down to one word that communicates your chief concern, the thing that's really bothering you, and then just shout it out. And I asked someone in the audience to write down all the words that people shouted so that we could keep track of these lists. And then we listened, and then we listened. And I listened to the words in every city and every event in every country. And on my last plane ride home, after so many of these events, I pulled out all the pieces of paper that the person had given me at the end of the lecture. And I read over all the lists of words that people had shouted out over those 14 months. And I made one small list, one short list that represented words that appeared on nearly every single list. They appeared in every city and they appeared in every country. And later, as I thought about it, I said to myself, these words represent the preoccupations that are alive for us, the conditions of existence that are alive for us in the new moral milieu of our young information civilization. And I'm going to read you this short list right now. Freedom, democracy, resistance, rebellion, awareness, power, rights, action, autonomy, justice, constitution, rule of law, anxiety, manipulation, confusion, control, disorientation, anger, invasion, fear, extraction, invasion, privacy, mistrust, feeling. Our comprehension of what has been the case leaps forward when we are confronted with the challenge of grasping, naming, and explaining something that has never been before. These words, shared by so many, embody the sense of a threat to what has been cherished. Flashpoints of anger and disorientation, flashpoints of hope. They tell a story of a young information civilization that has not yet found its footing in democracy. I draw a parallel here between our time and the earliest phases of industrialization. Imagine a 20th century where the employers, the owners of capital, still had all the power. They decided what happened with child labor, how children worked and for how many hours and what they were paid. They decided on all the standards against which workers were paid and their work hours and their working conditions. There were no workers' rights to join a union or strike or bargain collectively. There were no consumers' rights. There were no institutions to oversee everything from industrial relations to environmental protection or social safety nets. Eventually, these rights, laws, and institutions were forged from the creativity and determination of citizens and lawmakers, workers and consumers. It happened in Europe, it eventually happened in America and around the world. These were slow processes. Most of it happened in my country in the third and the fourth decades of the 20th century. But whether it began in the late 19th century or waited in 45 years later until the fourth decade of the 20th century, all of it was intended to ensure that industrial capitalism evolved under the rule of law tethered to democratic principles and governance. The world's liberal democracies have failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democratic values, principles, and government for our time. This failure has left a void where democracy should be, and that dangerous result now has been a 2-decade-long drift toward the private systems of surveillance and behavioral control that we've talked about, outside the rule of law and democratic governance. This is our work now. And rather than go into detail about what we can do, what we should do, what we must do, I want to draw things to a close now, leave this for our discussion time, and simply to say that democracy is under siege in a way that only democracy can cure. Not a pronouncement of doom, but a call to action. This next decade, the third decade, is critical. And my hope is that every one of you listening today, and every one of you who will listen to this in the future, will be part of this undertaking that falls to every generation to ensure that our digital century is also a democratic century. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shoshana. I mean, this is a wonderfully rich discussion of so many different topics, so many different issues and struggles and concerns, that it's almost hard to know where to begin. What I find is ringing still in my mind is your list that you read out towards the end of your talk just now, and it's a fascinating image, this idea of certain shared universals, despite a great many differences of geography and place and age and gender and race that you would have encountered on the tour. And I wonder whether there isn't something in that. I thought the choice of words that people decided to throw out, what would you throw from the back foot? What would you put into the fray if you could only choose one thing? You know, maybe it's because I'm a parent. I'm surprised that care wasn't there. How do we organize care through our politics? But what does come through quite clearly is a sense of voice. There is a sense, and this relates, I think, to your point about the need to define what this informational society, civilization, as you say, will be. How do we define that? How do we come together? How do we bring that voice into institutions, into reforms, into the kind of concrete changes that will bring about a different digital future? And as I mentioned at the start, you don't lose faith in the possibility. You don't reject digital altogether. What you focus upon is the ways in which that manage your reference now to authority, to power, to knowledge, and how those three are corralled away and kept out of the hands of individual citizens. And I found the anecdote you gave of the use of Facebook incredibly powerful here, to literally behavioralize people away from doing what would be in their best interest as incentive, as a way of expressing, certainly for Black citizens in particular, as a way of expressing their rejection of the system in a way that very clearly would not allow them to achieve the ends that they wanted. So you put it very nicely in a recent article in the New York Times, where you say we can have democracy or the surveillance society, but we can't have both. And so I'd like us to sort of, in a way, focus a little bit on that conundrum, on what it is that democracy can do for us and what we need to do for democracy in order that we can change some of this. So we have a situation today where we have and you described it very well, for 43 years you've been working on this. For the first half, predominantly computerization, the digital, it's happening in the workspace. The second half of this period, it's gone into the domestic, to the private, has reshaped that. So we have this basic dynamic, and it's been managed in a certain set of ways. It's been managed in another set of ways in China, where you have a much more clear kind of merging of the authoritarian state with the powers of digital surveillance. But it's been done through surveillance capitalism and through monopoly power in the liberal democracies. And that is, in a sense, what we need to try and address. So one question I have is, because you do speak about this in the book and in some of your other writings, to begin to change that, what is a sufficient first step? You talk about antitrust movements, and you kind of say, well, yes, we need that. But the problem with things like Facebook, with Apple, with Google, is not just that they're monopolies. There's more that we need to do. So I guess my first question is, where do we start? If we have to prioritize the sorts of things that need to be addressed, where does one begin that journey? That seems to me something that there are so many possible answers to. One's almost bewildered by a sense of what's the first thing to change. But you've seen this. You probably have a sense of where we need to go first.
Well, let's skip back to this geopolitical context for a moment, because I think it's really important to point this out. You bring up China. I mentioned the fact that the liberal democracies have failed as a group, not just, and so this is where the civilizational perspective is so important. Failed as a group. We failed as a civilization, as an information civilization that shares democratic values and principles. We failed to evolve a vision of the design and deployment of the digital in ways that advance the democratic prospect, advance the democratic form of government, yes, but also the values and aspirations of democratic people. And this would be bad enough. This failure would be bad enough But it is exacerbated in contrast to the Chinese, where the Chinese state, and specifically the Chinese Communist Party, has been extremely intentional and diligent about a very carefully developed vision of the design and deployment of digital technologies that advance its version of an authoritarian state. And these this vision and these capabilities are, as many people understand, now the hallmarks of both their domestic and their foreign policy. They are exporting not only to the western provinces of China itself, Xinjiang and everything that we know about, Xinjiang is essentially an open air prison driven by complete surveillance. But they export these to other countries in virtually every part of the world, not only technology, but personnel. So they're exporting a kind of institutional package that allows other regimes to learn how to become an authoritarian state using instrumentarian power as its key channels and means. So this really ups the ante on the question of information civilization, because now, as I mentioned, you can imagine a civilization cutting across many nation states, many societies, but even, each one, having its own kind of spin, but sharing a larger set of values, this larger moral milieu. But really what's happened now in the world is we have a kind of, well, certainly two information civilizations unfolding, possibly three. And this really gets interesting because this is the bridge to answering the concrete question, Simon, about, what do we do first? But so we have the Chinese version of information civilization, which is quite distinctive from the US-led version. I won't say it's only in the US because it is participated in, certainly in the UK, and to various degrees across Europe and other parts of the world. But this vision is one not of a surveillance state, but of a surveillance society. The Chinese surveillance state, obviously, driven by its political leadership, but the surveillance society in the West is driven by surveillance capitalism as a market project. Both aim for certainty, but in one case, certainty is for political control, and in the other case, certainty is for commercial control and commercial outcomes, commercial objectives. So now, underneath those differences, there are a lot of similarities. There's ubiquitous monitoring, there's instrumentarian power used for behavioral modification at scale, right? So at that level, there are a lot of similarities in the mechanisms and operations, the means, but actually at the higher level of the values and purposes, these really are two distinct civilizations. And the reason I say that there might be a third is because, right now, the political leadership in Europe really is trying to carve out a third way, and it has gone further than anyone else in the world. The European democracies, the European Union, the European Commission have gone further than anyone else to say, we insist upon a vision of the digital that is inherently democratic, that embodies democratic values and principles, that comes under the rule of law of democratic institutions. And we want to make this explicit, and we want to enshrine this in law. this will not happen quickly. It will not happen, you know, in a year or in either in a cycle of one leadership group being in office or an election cycle, but it can happen and indeed must happen over the next few years, certainly in this decade. And we see the foundations being laid here in Europe. So the way that I summarize this, Simon, is to say the first step down this road is that the digital must live in democracy's house. The idea of cyberspace, as I've suggested, was a myth. And it was a myth that successfully defended these companies from any kind of incursion, from lawmaking, from regulation, from new charters of rights, from citizens' demands. There's no 911 to call Google. There's no 411 to call Facebook or Amazon or Microsoft or Apple or any of the others, right? So, so the first thing that has to happen is we undertake this shift from the growing, massive, and entirely unaccountable power, not of cyberspace, but there's no, you know, what is cyberspace? It's corporations, it's capital, it's machines, it's data, it's software. What is cyberspace? Cables, you know. So we get rid of this mythos, and we get real about what's going on here. This is raw power of capital under the regime of surveillance capitalism. And we say the laws, values, principles, and rights that adhere for our citizens of democratic societies in every domain also adhere in this domain, the domain that we have thought of as digital. There are no digital rights. There are human rights, there are citizens' rights, and they apply everywhere. So we have to get out of that exceptional kind of thinking. So the very first thing is the digital lives in democracy's house. And what this is so great, and then I'll stop because I'll only mention the first thing because you asked me about the first thing. But this is so great because what does it mean? It means if the digital lives in democracy's house, hallelujah. Because right now, we don't have the data, they have the data. The data comes from us, the data is about us, the data is intended to influence us and get us to do things, but we don't have the data. We can't use the data, we don't even know what it says. We only know the little bit of data that we give them. But when you talk about trillions of data points every day and 6 million predictions per second, very little of that is the data we give them. Most of that is what they take without our knowing, right? They don't need your attention, folks. They take whether you're paying attention or not. So this is the reality. So so what were we promised in the digital era? The data to improve our lives, the data to improve our cities, the data to improve our ability to survive diseases, the data to solve the crisis of climate. This is what we need the data for. But right now, they've claimed ownership of the data. If I were in a room shouting out a word, Simon, the word I'd be shouting out is the word intolerable. This is intolerable and illegitimate.
It's fascinating because actually, in a way, what you sketch out is there's a dual task really. One is the narrative. There is a narrative that we need to reclaim. That, for example, this is a wild west. That somehow there is this open space, this open frontier where there aren't regulations that don't apply. But as you rightly point out, they do. The rights exist already. They just need to be enforced. And then on the other hand, we have this actually much more technical work, but of course it's political work as well, of actually trying to enforce the legislation, to put on the books, the statutes that are required, and so on. And there are lessons from history one can draw from there. You mentioned the European example, and I think that's interesting because the European democracy, to the extent that we can think about it as a democracy, it's a procedural democracy. It's a democracy of process. And you know, Tocqueville and others will tell us that actually, of course, there's another way of thinking about democracy, which is about its values, about the manners of society. And this, I think, gets a little bit at your lovely sort of quote on the moral milieu of the civilization we want to build. And I wonder whether, as part of that, a part of the step we have to take is to address this issue of trust. I mean, I mentioned it also at the very top of my introduction this morning. You know, it's been fascinating to me during the pandemic to watch as contact tracing apps, for example, have been rolled out in different ways. And some of them have been run through state authorities, and some of them have been run through some of the companies that you study and are private exercises. And what's been actually fascinating for me to see is that the trust that people have in the state contact tracing apps is sometimes less than they have in the private contact tracing apps. And that seems incredible, because it suggests that we are, in a sense, in this vicious circle of knowledge, authority, and power that is not ours to define. And until we can do that, it's hard to actually then think how we would find the belief, the hope, the trust in changing that intolerable situation as you see it. So how do we, you know, how do we find a way to move forward? You've given us a great example of the first element of that. I wonder whether another element of that is to look to history and to see how people have done it in the past, to understand that, you know, we are still inhabiting a 20th century institutional arrangement in our liberal democracies today, and they are not necessarily adequate to the task of what we need them to be adequate to. So you described very nicely in the book at different points, we sort of live in this eternal present. We need to jump forward to a future. We need to claim that future in certain ways, but we sort of almost lack the language, the vocabulary of doing it. It's why I was so struck by your list as a way of beginning that process. So I mean, do you think there's a hope for us to move beyond that kind of eternal present? Do you think we can overcome our own worst angels to torture a famous book title? You know, because so many of us are drawn into these things, as you say. It meets a need. We all have a desire. We all want to be sociable. That's the one side of it. We also want to be private, and both of those very legitimate needs are captured, entrained, and then put to the service of something else. And I just find that a fascinating problem for us all to work through.
Well, let me mention a couple of things. So I'm keen that you brought up the example of what happened with the exposure notification protocol in April of 2020. This is a very pregnant example, and I'm very interested in it, and I've been writing about it. But to me, this is an example of what I call the fourth stage of the epistemic coup, which is epistemic dominance. And this dominance is expressed in the fact that, you know, we're kind of waking up to the fact that these private companies really have absolute and unaccountable power over what have become critical information systems and infrastructures. So this was a poignant example in Europe, because the Germans and the French, aided by teams from Italy and Spain, you know, were developing some really terrific exposure notification and contact tracing applications that would satisfy the needs of helping individuals stay safe, but also satisfy the needs of the epidemiologists in the various countries of Europe to figure out what's going on with our people. And what happened here very, very quickly was that the companies leveraged their epistemic dominance, their control of the operating system, which is critical infrastructure. The operating system on their smartphones, the Android and the iOS, these are critical infrastructure, communications infrastructure in an information civilization. And they showed that they have, not only do they exercise absolute control, but they have no compunction about throwing their weight around the room and using that absolute control to get what they want. And it appears to me that what they wanted was to drive a wedge between people and their governments.
So that sort of speaks to this wider issue of the need for us to form legislation potentially around declare rights that didn't exist before because they weren't deemed to be problematic, right? You know, the right to what's done with your face, as you sometimes put it, that it's taken and used and then can be used against your issue, or certain used to make money for somebody else. And that's an incredibly fraught process. It makes me, it makes me wonder, what are the sociologies, I guess, behind this coming struggle, if we put it in those terms? What are the underlying dynamics that are going to feed into this redefinition of digital civilization, which of course is a term that also has its own history. I want to begin to bring in some of the comments we have from the audience here, because we have some interesting questions that have been put to you, and one of them picks up on exactly this question I'm raising now about, what is it that really becomes a prerequisite for changing the surveillance capitalism that feeds off inequality. Angus Nichols from Queen Mary, actually one of our colleagues, says here that it seems to be the case that surveillance capitalism has fundamentally undermined assumptions that were common to late 20th century political theory. So it gives an example of Habermas's idea of rational political debate taking place in the sort of unified public sphere. Taking into account the proliferation of myths that you mentioned in your talk, he says, will facts, rational analysis and critique ever be powerful enough to oppose the new digitally mediated political myths? Or must progressive politics, which I guess is in a way what we've begun talking about, also take recourse to non-rational modes of persuasion, i.e. to counter myths? So it comes back a little bit to my question about narrative, but what is it that will be required to counter those dominant narratives of this is all to your good, this is free goods that you can engage in if you wish and you have the choice?
All right, so there's sort of two levels of rhetorical problems here. One is the fact that the surveillance capitalists are fantastic at just very quickly producing rhetoric that's essentially propaganda. I typically refer to it as gaslighting, in the sense that they know how to roll out well-crafted sentences and metaphors and claims that kind of rivet people's imagination. And in fact, that's what they did in Europe with the exposure notification protocol. They quickly commandeered the language of decentralized versus centralized, which was, just it would have been comic if it weren't so terribly, terribly important. But the idea that they are decentralized and therefore privacy privileging, for anybody who knows this much about what's going on, is deeply hilarious. But the fact is, they were able to commandeer and over again the language of decentralization, privacy privileging, and then call this, what the state was doing, centralized, and therefore conjuring up all the Orwellian ghosts. And that's essentially how they got their way. And privacy advocates actually helped them. Many privacy advocates, I think there were about 350 that signed a list that said, yeah, we go for decentralization. So that was a dark moment in our general conversation about privacy. But the fact of the matter is that, and let me, if I may for a moment, just talk about US data. In the US, which, as you know, has been lagging Europe in its concern about privacy, both among the citizenry and among our lawmakers. But in the US right now, when you look at the survey data, what you see is essentially a complete rupture of faith with these companies. We're seeing majorities in the 70th, 80th, and even 90th percentiles of people saying, these companies have too much power, they create more problems than they solve. We don't trust them to fix the problems that they've produced, like disinformation. We don't trust the individual leaders. The only thing in all of these surveys that is less trusted than Mark Zuckerberg, as you know, the founder and CEO of Facebook, the only thing that's less trusted is the tobacco industry. So the companies really are at a low point. And this is important because we've always had strong negatives going right back to the beginning of the early 2000s. When you tell people, hey, this is what the company is really doing, are you okay with this? People say no. How do I get out of here? How do I get a choice? How do I hide? You know, I don't want anything to do with this. But increasingly, there's been no way to exit. There have been no other choices. And so we're kind of stuck. Now, people are angry about being stuck. And this is coming through in the survey material. We're also seeing lawmakers really hitting back for the first time. So, you know, from where I sit, I feel like we are either turning a corner or we really have turned a corner. I mean, you know, one of our great antitrust experts, a young woman named Lena Khan, a professor from Yale, yesterday was appointed chair of the Federal Trade Commission. On March 24th, we had congressional hearings here in the US. Again, I use this because we've been a laggard, where for the first time we had Congress people telling the tech executives, we know that this is your economics, and we know that this disinformation is produced by your economics, and it doesn't have to be this way, and you have unaccountable power, and we're going to hold you to account. So is it going to take a little while to achieve that? Yes, but they were saying it, deeply informed, really smart, really brave, and they were saying it. So, you know, we got to look for, you know, what's emerging from from all of this conflict. There are really, I think, new things emerging. In the UK, of course, you had the Digital Harms Bill. Unfortunately, it became the Digital Safety Bill. Harms is better, safety is better than nothing. But there's still some very important things in that legislation that are game changers as far as the work that we have to do to begin to interrupt and ultimately outlaw the key operations of surveillance capitalism. So that's one level of the rhetorical battles that are going on, where I think that, you know, citizens and lawmakers are starting to punch back and are starting to punch back effectively. You use the term digitally mediated, and that's something that I want to bring to everyone's attention for a moment, because my advice would be, let's stop using the word technology, period. And instead of technology, let's either just say surveillance capitalism, or let's say capitalism, but let's just stop saying technology. Because the problem that we have right now is not that our speech is digitally mediated. The problem that we have is that it's institutionally mediated. It's mediated by a political economic institution called surveillance capitalism. So we can have, you know, like we can talk to each other over telephone, we can talk to each other over the internet, and it can be okay. You know, we needed laws and rules and rights for telephony, for radio, for television. We need laws and rules and rights for the internet. But that's what we need to protect ourselves from the institutional interference of surveillance capitalism is a level above, because this is a pernicious political economic logic whose imperatives not only are there to muddy what we say, but to specifically not only mine it, but change it in crazy ways, to amplify it, to select out of all of the given spectrum of speech, to select the speech that in a normal society would begin and end at the margins, would begin and end at the fringe of society. You don't need censorship in a free society because crazy speech is spoken at the fringe and it stays at the fringe. But in the sociological world of the mediated speech through surveillance capitalism, the craziest speech is privileged. The algorithms seek out the craziest speech and they amplify it, they disseminate it, they put it right in the center of what they still pretend is a public sphere. And they put it in the center so that everybody has to deal with it. And the reason is that they understand that the human brain is oriented toward the grotesque in the same way that our taste buds are oriented towards sugar. And so the more grotesquerie they put, you know, right in front of us, the more we're going to engage, the more we engage, the more they extract. The more they extract, the more data they have, the better their predictions, the more money they make, and the more capability they have to target. The more they target, the more they modify our behavior, the greater the certainty. And we have these endless loops that go round and round.
Back to the vicious circle. But I mean, there are two things that this brings up. One is I love this idea of the sort of, it's a sort of pseudo public realm. It is public, but not in its intent, not in its function, not in the way that it services individuals as a community in our common interest as citizens. But the other side of this is more actually, and it's a question raised by Miriam Goldby here also in the audience, and another colleague at QM. And she asks, is it possible to have an information society without it being a surveillance society within the current capitalist framework? And if so, how do we achieve that? Is it law or regulation? I guess we said a little about that now, but she goes on to ask, are rule makers and rule enforcers captured to such an extent that this simply can't be done? So I mean, I guess here, and Miriam, apologies, I'm not putting words in your mouth here, but it sort of strikes me that this is a little bit about the idea of hegemony, a little bit about the idea of a kind of cultural acceptance. And if so, I wonder your thoughts, Shoshana, on the role of something as simple as education in all of this. You know, we can march on the streets, and we can you know, fight within the corridors of power for reform, but we need to understand why we're doing that first of all. And clearly writing a book, you know, is one way of bringing to attention certain ideas. But I mean, do you think that really this is this something that we need to fundamentally rethink the way we teach certain assumptions in a whole range of different things? And I ask this partly as a sort of as somebody who directs an interdisciplinary center. You know, across the things, we've been doing a lot of work recently around decolonizing curricula and so forth. And that's critical to changing mindsets about how certain things, undoing certain assumptions. Are we sort of in a similar space here in terms of trying to peel back what is so easily assumed to be normal, but which of course is entirely constructed?
Well, I mean, education of our students, but also education of the public right now, is certainly the highest calling, because the reason that I was on the road for 14 months instead of 3 weeks is because of this, is because people are feeling the effects of this secret, hidden, invisible power without a way to name it and understand it. And the catharsis that is unleashed, which is why I brought in my cherished list of words, Simon, but the catharsis that is unleashed when you give people or help them create the vocabulary to name and grasp. This goes back to Freire's wonderful work of, helping people understand this is the situation that we're in. Let's decipher it, let's deconstruct it, let's name it, let's create a vocabulary for it. And then let's get together and decide what we want to do about it. So these things all have to occur in parallel processing. We don't have time to do sequential reasoning. We need to do public education, but we need to do law. So many years ago, when I was a youngster in the mid-90s, I developed what I called Zuboff's 3 laws. The first 2 are easy. Everything that can be automated will be automated. Everything that can be informated will be informated. The 3rd law was all digital produced information will be used for surveillance and control. That can be all digitally produced information that can be used for surveillance and control will be used for surveillance and control in the absence of countervailing rights, laws, rules, norms, and sanctions.
And this is exactly what we've had for decades.
So can we have a digital society without surveillance? Absolutely. Can we have a digital society without the rights and laws that assign epistemic rights to individuals and to communities? No. Can we have a digital society without surveillance, without laws that prohibit unilateral, secret, illegitimate extraction of personal experience? No, we can't. We require new rights and new laws. Now, is this somehow too big a mountain for us to climb? Absolutely not. Come on, I mean, in my country, as late as 1930, employers had all the rights. Workers we still did not have defined laws giving workers the right to strike and bargain collectively and join a union. The National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935. That was 45 years after the Sherman Act, which was the Antitrust Act, which came in 1890. So the Antitrust Act, it broke up Standard Oil, but what did it do? It broke up a big oil company into 36 small fossil fuel companies. And they very quickly re-agglomerated, and pretty soon you had ExxonMobil. So it wasn't until we actually gave people what they wanted, which was demands for the rights and the laws to protect those rights, that would truly balance the power between, in that case, in the 20th century, labor and capital. Now we have to balance the power between citizens and surveillance capital. Because as you mentioned, Simon, we're no longer talking about operations that are trained on the economic domain. We've jumped the firewall here. These operations, and that's why I said, who would have imagined the economic imperatives are such that they require all human behavior in every domain, in your bedroom, in your bathroom, on your way to work, all human behavior to be more predictable. And in order to do that, to collect data from every corner of your life that heretofore was considered private. So this is all of us, of society, of the social.
And that brings in, and it'll probably have to be the last point that I raise. And apologies to some of you who've put some interesting comments in. A lot of the questions stem on this question around where the limits to surveillance capitalism can be found, and so there are questions around whether you would transfer the big tech companies to other questions around companies that privatize academic knowledge production, for example. We have a number of questions around this idea of civilization and its particular genealogy, which has, you know, hierarchical elements in it as well. But there's a question here finally about open access science, and it's an interesting one. It's from George Elder. George, I'm not sure Professor Zuboff will have a chance to answer this, but you do raise, I think, a really interesting question around open access science and whether, in a sense, transparency is part of the solution to the problem of the expropriation of private goods. You use the example here of the Human Genome Project in the early 2000s, where a privatization bullet was dodged, he says. However, this seems not to be the case with tools such as AlphaFold and similar corporation-developed scientific tools. Similar examples exist with facial recognition software, which can be used in medical image analysis as well as in the reverse. So, as well as thanking you for your talk, he's really, I think, opening an important question here around exactly how we change the terms upon which this knowledge can be expropriated by some rather than others. I don't think we'll have a chance to get into that, Shoshana, since we've reached really the end of our hour and a half. I've found it to be a fascinating discussion. I would love to keep talking about this. You will keep talking about this. You will keep writing about this. There is an important debate to be taken forward. I'm incredibly grateful that you've found some time to come and share these thoughts with us today and to listen to some of the questions from our own audience here, to continue what is clearly a global discussion around a series of pretty pressing issues in contemporary society. I would like to thank you for that. I would also like to thank Anna and Jolanta, who have been incredibly helpful here at the IHSS in arranging this talk and making it happen. And I'd like to thank our audience for your time and for listening in what I know is always a busy time of year. And with that, we must unfortunately draw this, our second annual symposium, to a close. So thank you, keep safe, think well, and it's bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Shoshana.